I mentioned that the 20% of the budget is set aside for education, but a lot of that goes into the basic education area. There's a major role played by the private sector. We don't get to hear a lot about it because a lot of the government-to-government relationships are between government universities in Australia and government universities in Indonesia. The aid budget for the Australian Development Scholarship Program tends to be mainly for government university staff to study at universities in Australia. There's, however, on a positive side, the Australian government does recognise the importance of the Islamic education sector in Indonesia and is doing a lot of work to support that sector, and we'll say more about that in a moment. In relation to the United States, I think that we also tend to get a little bit carried away with how important we are, and yet we don't recognise just how important the rest of the world is in the eyes of Indonesia, particularly when we realise that President Obama spent 3 years at primary school in Indonesia, understands the psyche of Indonesians. When he talked about, I think when he visited Indonesia and talked about 3 components of being a young Indonesian is you eat bakso soup, you eat satay, and you eat rambutan fruit. Now, if you hadn't been in Indonesia, you wouldn't know that, but he connects to the Indonesian people in a way that no Australian politician is ever going to be able to connect to them, and therefore has put Indonesia very much on the scene for the education and cultural relationship between between United States and Indonesia. And last year they opened in Jakarta the world's first high-tech cultural centre at America, and I'd recommend that anybody who's going to Indonesia goes to Pacific Place Centre and visits the future of cultural diplomacy, which is not in the example of the British Council, because that's too dangerous now to have British Council. Just look what happened last week in Afghanistan. The high-tech centre that the Americans have got in Jakarta, I think, is the way of the future. There's not one piece of paper in it. It's all high-tech, and it's all about connecting through video conferencing and other forms of technology, the United States and Indonesia. Speaking of the positive things between Australia and Indonesia, I think despite Tony Abbott's efforts to downgrade the importance of this, the Australia-Indonesia Bridge Schools program, funded by AusAid, but managed through AEI and AsiaLink at the University of Melbourne, Asian Education Foundation, links 47 Indonesian schools with 46 Australian schools. And over 2,000 junior secondary schools have been built in Indonesia over a 5-year period through the Australian Aid Program. Now, this is hugely significant, and it's a very positive feature of the Australia-Indonesia relationship at a government-to-government level. The university sector is developing. It underperforms for the task that it has at hand. It also is important, as I mentioned earlier, the private sector. The private sector is the majority of universities. And we also have a lot of competition here. We think, okay, well, maybe people will go to the USA or maybe they'll go to the UK, but Singapore as a regional education hub, Malaysia as a hub, Germany as the considered preeminent vocational and technical training country in the world, we've got a lot of work to do if we want to convince regional countries that Australia has the best vocational education and training system. While Indonesia is a top 10 source country, in 2010, with 9,000 commencing students, forget about the enrolments because a lot of them don't actually come here, but commencing students, 9,000, that was number 9. USA was number 10, means there's 8 other countries above Indonesia in terms of source countries to study in Australia. You'd have to ask yourself the question, how can it be that a country of of nearly 240 million people on our doorstep is only our 9th largest educational partner country. Vocational education and training, as in India, and thank you very much for your incisive survey of the Indian situation, it's the sleeping giant in Indonesia as well, and doesn't have enough capacity to address the issues that Indonesia has to face in the vocational education and training area. But there's again, lots of recognition of that by both countries and by agencies such as the ADB, and there's a big ADB project coming up in 2012 in Indonesia. The same demographic divide that impacts on India impacts on Indonesia, and job creation has to be, for economic and political stability, has to be the #1 priority. Some of the hurdles for foreign investment in education and training in Indonesia is, I mean, it's the same as every other country, finding the right fit partner. I mean, you talk to any people who are involved in international education, they'll tell you the horror story about finding the wrong fit partner. Then there are the issues around bureaucracy of trying to get approvals, some inconsistent and ambiguous regulations. For example, currently in Indonesia, if you want to be an English language teacher working for an English language school, which is running as a business in Indonesia, you have to have a degree in English. So in Australia, as long as you've got a qualification to be an English language teacher, you can have a degree in anything. But in Indonesia, for some reason, you have to have a degree in English to be considered to be able to be an English language teacher. The issue of TVET fees, again, the issue of can you actually successfully do vocational education and training in Indonesia becomes a question of what is your price point? Does your price point meet the reality of operating in Indonesia? If it doesn't, you don't have a business. And just one point I'll bring up there about the digital divide is real. However, in Indonesia, there is this, the take-up of the internet, because Indonesians are very communicative people. They like to be talking to each other. And they've got the geographic makeup of a country, which means they've got to find a good way of communicating across vast distances. And we have an office in Sydney. We also operate in Indonesia. Thank you.